it's my honor to invite my friend, Aida representing UNECA, to give UNECA's welcome remarks.
Thank you, Chair. Distinguished representative of the government of Tunisia, distinguished representatives for the partner organizations AUC, ADB, and UNDP, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, I'm happy to welcome you on behalf of ECA and the Executive Secretary of ECA, Dr. Carlos Lopez, and the organizing institutions to the Africa-wide consultations on the post-2015 development agenda. Some of you will recall that this process began in October of 2011 when ECA and partners launched an electronic survey to assess the views of civil society, governments, the private sector, and academia on the MDGs and the post-2015 development agenda. This was followed, as you heard from the moderator, by regional and sub-regional consultations in Accra, Ghana, in November 2011, Mombasa, Kenya in October 2012, and Dakar, Senegal in December of the same year. This process of early consultations has helped strengthen Africa's voice in the global discourse on this particular agenda. The consultations over the next 2 days provides us an opportunity to validate and sharpen our messaging on this post-2015 issues as we move to the next step of articulating an African common position. As we spend these 2 days deliberating what Africa's priorities should be in the post-MDG era, I would like to take this opportunity to reflect on how several key shortfalls of the MDGs calls for 3 critical considerations for a post-2015 agenda. First, the MDGs largely ignores issues of equity and economic transformation, and thus a successor to this initiative must be a transformative agenda that brings about both economic and social change whilst paying attention to development enablers as well as outcomes. Second, the MDGs face critical challenges of monitoring, and thus there is the need for more reliable data and target setting in order to accurately monitor progress. And last, but certainly not the least, I would also like to highlight the utmost importance of an inclusive, member state-driven, and a multi-stakeholder process towards a post-2015 development agenda. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, there is little doubt that the MDGs have been tremendously successful in leveraging both political and economic support around a set of global issues identified to be integral to human development. The goals have consequently framed the policy discourse, shaped global partnerships, informed national and frameworks, and influenced global funding priorities for over a decade now. In effect, the MDGs have and continue to play an important role in the development agenda of developing countries in particular. Africa has indeed made good progress on some of the economic and social indicators. Despite erratic data, the continent has made some big leaps. For instance, secondary school enrollment grew by 48% between 2000 and 2008 after states expanded their education programs. Poverty rates have fallen below 50%, and almost all children are enrolled in primary school, and the fight against HIV/AIDS resulted in substantial declines in prevalence and incidence rates. To give another example, in Ethiopia, infant mortality rates have fallen by 40% since 2000, and under 5 mortality rates by 45%. Even though this is well below the global average, the situation has improved rapidly from a very low base. However, we're also very conscious that the MDGs surely has many shortfalls, and that's why we're here. One of the main shortcomings in Africa in terms of progress towards the MDGs is inequality characterized by spatial and demographic disparities in access to basic services. Gender disparities in school completion rates and unequal access to health, water, sanitation facilities are worrying and call for targeted interventions. These inequalities are largely a result of non-inclusive growth in the development process. While there has been rapid economic growth across the continent and a decline in poverty, nearly half of Africa's population still lives on $1.25 per day. And whereas there have been substantial improvements in access to education and healthcare, vast inequalities persist amongst income groups, geographical regions, between men and women, boys and girls. It is also worth noting that Africa's recent growth has not generated enough jobs due to the enclave nature of most economies. Much more progress can be achieved if concerted efforts are made to add value to raw materials through an aggressive industrialization drive that generates employment opportunities for a majority of our population. A more diversified economic structure will also be critical in strengthening Africa's resilience to economic and climate-related shocks. In order to truly achieve inclusive human and social development, and therefore achieve either the MDGs or whatever set of goals comes after 2015, Africa must undergo a structural transformation that brings about inclusive growth. What do we mean when we say structural transformation? Well, the key elements of an effective transformation agenda can be reflected in a declining share of agriculture in GDP and employment, the transformation of rural areas into vibrant hubs of agribusiness and industrial activity, the rise of the modern industrial service economy, the translation of Africa's youth bulge into a demographic dividend, access to social services that meet minimum standards of quality regardless of location, reduced inequality, spatial and gender, and progress towards an inclusive green growth trajectory. Put in another way, we can say that the development process involves the transformation of economy and society. Ladies and gentlemen, Africa's low development has often been attributed in part to the continent's failure to transform its primary commodity-based economies into manufacturing-based structure. Therefore, structural transformation is imperative if countries wish to generate enough resources and high productivity jobs to achieve goals of human development. In this regard, a successor framework to the MDGs must also rectify the current focus on development outcomes without enablers. This is an effect that identifies a destination without providing a roadmap. While it is true that each country should be free to develop its own roadmap, it is also true that there are some generally accepted enablers of development. By highlighting the important role of peace and security, institutional strengthening, and infrastructure development, a post-2015 development agenda can be instrumental in unlocking some of the binding constraints to development and structural transformation at the national and regional level. A second shortcoming of the current MDGs was the failure to anticipate the data challenges associated with monitoring their achievement. A number of indicators are simply not being monitored due to data limitations and weak institutional capacity for data gathering and analysis. Countries have adapted to the situation of customizing targets and indicators to their specific contexts and data constraints. This, however, undermines cross-country comparisons. It also means that effective monitoring of progress on the MDGs remains a challenge, especially in Africa. Therefore, the success of the post-2015 agenda will hinge on how effectively it tackles the data constraint. On its part, ECA will help in the context of its new strategic directions to overcome this challenge by working hard to generate robust data and statistics on economic and social conditions in the continent. Distinguished participants, as we go forward with our deliberations over the next 2 days, we are especially focused on a third key shortfall of the MDGs: lack of adequate consultations and country ownership. In this context, let us take a moment to understand how the MDGs came to dominate development policy so successfully. There was first there was, first of all, an innovative political process leading to the adoption of the MDGs by heads of states and governments. This consensus document was mainly political. Meanwhile, work by the OECD, IMF, World Bank, and UNDP, and later UNDESA, led to the framing of the MDGs by marrying technical discussions about poverty to the political content of the Millennium Declaration. It, however, took 5 years before member states formally adopted the MDGs, which were already being used by the UN. This gave the unfortunate impression of the UN Secretariat leading the process and led to criticisms of weak ownership by member states. This is something to avoid for the future. Africa now has a unique opportunity to lead the process by developing a new development agenda. You are here today because we want to hear your voice. We want the agenda to be country-owned rather than top-down prescribed, rather than a top-down prescribed agenda. It is on this note that I truly wish you fruitful deliberations on emerging African perspectives on the post-2015 agenda. And special thanks at this stage goes to the government of Tunisia and the Africa Development Bank for hosting us. I thank you for your kind attention.